Hey guys, what is going on? So in this video, we're talking the DJI Spark and how to make your footage more cinematic by different ways of flying. I'm sure some of you are wondering what is going on behind me. There's like a ton of just camera gear over there. There's like a bunch of stuff right here that you don't see. But basically, I'm redoing my entire office, my entire editing space, my whole desk, my closet, all that stuff. Basically, it's become such a mess and we travel so much and we're always on the go that when I come home, I want to have a clean and fluid system that is super minimalistic and just super has the things that I need. So right now, I'm basically just like stripping everything. I'm basically going to get a huge desk and I'm going to switch to the MacBook Pro, which shows up today, and I'm going to revamp my entire system to work with USB-C because that is the future, and if you don't have your system set up properly, you're gonna have to do it at some point anyways. So I'm going to just future-proof my entire setup. I'll create a video about that soon, but guys, let's get into the DJI Spark cinematic techniques. I know you guys are gonna like these. There's some cool stuff. Basically, you gotta remember that the Spark is a tiny drone. It's got a 2-axis gimbal, so there's certain moves that I would do on a bigger drone, on a Mavic, on something like that you can't do on the Spark. However, you can still get cinematic footage. The key thing is to think about your drone as if it's a big cinema camera, and that's how you're gonna get cinematic footage. So think of it as a helicopter with a huge gimbal and a big red and all that good stuff. When you think about your drone in that way and move it in that way, you're gonna get very cinematic footage. But on top of that, because it is tiny, I mean, it's like this big, you can get it in places that a big helicopter can't. So on top of thinking like a big camera on a big helicopter, all that good stuff, you gotta think how to use those kind of techniques, but in a setting where a drone this big can fly. And that's really where drones shine, is basically getting in those places, getting close to subjects, things that the bigger cameras can't. But you still gotta move it like a big camera. You gotta still think in terms of cinematic. All right, let me show you some footage and let's get into it. Number 1, no jerky movements. As soon as the camera jerks, it draws attention to the camera itself. The goal of being a filmmaker is doing such a good job that the viewer is engaged with the story and the visuals you present to them, and they're not thinking about the cameras themselves. You're almost trying to be so good at what you do that you end up being hidden. Move the camera in all planes of motion. Forwards, backwards, side to side, adding in upwards and downwards movements. Big, gradual moves will make it feel more dramatic and cinematic. Use these types of movements to reveal a character or a landscape. You want your drone to make the shot feel epic because it has an epic view from the sky. Number 3, move before your subject does. This is when you're working specifically with something that is in the frame and not just a landscape. You want to plan your shot so that your Spark is moving before the subject does. That way you can create a shot of visual interest, and then when your subject enters the frame, it changes the whole shot completely in a very cinematic way. Number 4, don't shoot directly into the sun. Because of the limited dynamic range on your Spark, you don't have the ability to shoot in high contrast situations without overexposing or underexposing. Use your histogram on screen and try to keep the exposure somewhere in the middle. This way you'll be able to grade your footage later. As soon as you blow your highlights, you'll lose the cinematic quality. Instead of shooting directly at the sun, point off somewhere else and compose a shot that has a proper exposure. Number 5, use the rule of thirds. If you lay a grid over your image, you'll want to keep your point of interest on one of the lines. This could be the horizon or it could be a subject in the frame. When you offset your main subject, you'll be able to create more visual interest across your image. Play with sport mode. Sport mode allows you to kick up the speed of your Spark. You can't do any crazy movements in this setting without being too jerky, but you can create some really stunning footage flying low and fast. Number 7, don't fly too high. Unless you're getting a super wide establishing shot, then flying high is what you want to avoid. You don't get much movement in the frame and your shots don't feel very cinematic. Instead, play low to the ground and closer to objects where you can see the landscape moving fast through the frame. Point the camera down. One of the coolest things about drones is it allows us to get a straight overhead shot. This was not an easy perspective to get before drones. Things look a lot different when you look straight down on them. Find ways to play with light and shadows to give your footage a different perspective. Number 9, use an ND filter. You want a slight blur with movement, which is why you use an ND filter on your Spark. These drop your shutter speeds closer to 1/60th or 180 degrees shutter, which is the standard for the cinematic look. My last tip is to think story. This is probably the number 1 tip I always tell people when they ask me how to make something cinematic. You gotta think story first. If it helps bring more life into your story, show a different perspective on your story, or just give you a different angle that helps further the story along, then you've created a cinematic shot. There's a ton of tips and there's a ton of ways to make your footage quote unquote cinematic. But with every tip and with every way to make it cinematic, there's people that are doing the complete opposite and breaking those rules. So there's no specific guidelines on what is cinematic, but there are things that you can do that are gonna make your film more impactful. And that's focusing on story. If the shot drives the story in some way, then it's a better shot than just having a cool looking shot because you had a drone fly through some crazy movement. At the end of the day, you always wanna think story because that is the most important thing when you're making any sort of film. Alright guys, I hope that was helpful. I hope those tips will help you get some cool cinematic footage when you go out and fly. Guys, make sure you subscribe and leave a comment below. Guys, if you have any questions about some of these tips that I've presented to you, anything else about the DJI Spark, leave it in the comments. I'll be doing a video soon about all this behind me. I know some of you are probably curious what my whole setup is, so I'm gonna put that together. Basically, my setup's gonna be not only something that can be here in my editing suite, big dual monitor, all that good stuff, but also something I can take with me on the road. So it's gonna be kind of a cool setup that's very minimalistic, but can do a lot. All right guys, that's it. I will see you on the next one.